You see, the law of God tells the truth because it is a transcript of the character of God. The Bible makes it very clear. You can't separate God from his law. His law are good, pure, they are holy, just, perfect, true, righteous, eternal.
If I were to choose a God, I would have chosen an abolitionist. This is something I didn't really consider when I was growing up, because honestly, I kind of thought the biblical God was an abolitionist. We talked about Exodus a lot, and I always thought the problem with the Hebrew people being enslaved in Egypt was that they were enslaved. Slavery's bad. These are my people, let my people go. And as a black Christian, the idea that there's a God that supernaturally intervenes when some portion of humanity decides that it is empowered and authorized to own others preaches. But the story of the Exodus isn't about ending slavery. It's God getting his people away from foreign rule and foreign gods. It's proving that Adonai is mightier than the Egyptian pantheon, and proving it one plague at a time. And when they get away, God gives them a covenant. He gives them the law. And in the heart of that law, the Sabbath commandment, he tells them to rest from their work, have their children rest, and their servants as well. Because human-to-human servitude is canonized in the laws that embody God's character. The only part of the Bible that the Bible claims God actually wrote with his own finger. The eternal commandment that I grew up reciting in congregational unison every Sabbath morning presumed the continued existence and acceptance of slavery. The whole next chapter of Exodus, many more verses than the Ten Commandments, lists God's laws regulating the way that the Hebrew people were allowed to treat their Hebrew slaves. And then slaves they took from other groups of people, most often in the form of virgin women and children, they were given more latitude. And when the Ten Commandments are given again in Deuteronomy 5, the whole purpose of the Sabbath, the reason God prescribes rest, is to remember that he freed you from being a slave yourself, yet still allows you to possess slaves yourself. I just never saw it. But why was it a surprise, right? God didn't interfere earlier, right after the flood, when Noah, his chosen one, cursed his own grandson's descendants to be the unregulated kind of slaves for their cousins. It wasn't that Sarah had a slave girl to offer to Abraham to impregnate that upset God. It was that they weren't patient enough to wait for the miracle. Jesus used a paradigm in his parables. Think of the prodigal son. He thinks so little of himself from his fall from prince to pigpen that he can only hope it could maybe possibly be something his father could consider to take him in as a servant. Like that contrast lands the story. Inspiration didn't tell Paul to say, masters, free your slaves, but slaves, obey your masters. Serve them like you're serving God. Did he tell the masters to treat them well? Sure, but abolish the system? Not a whisper. Now, what am I to think of an omniscient God that knew what Europe would do with that little oversight as it manifests destiny across the Atlantic? No. Is all slavery the same? I suppose not, especially if you want to go venturing through apologetic sources. Because it's always suggested that it was much less oppressive in the Old Testament world and the type of system we know from our own history. Which is funny, because this is the only context you can get American Christians to admit American slavery was terrible, when they need to differentiate it from what they think their God would allow. But it all stems from the moral error of thinking that something about this kind of people elevates them above this kind. That if not forever, I can own you until you achieve something for me. And in my opinion, there was never a time in human history where that type of system was not manipulated or abused. No time you could call it good. Because the problem is that these stories are written in a world of lords and servants. And whether or not that system is better or worse than our modern conception of civilization is an entirely different discussion. That was their capitalism, their stock market, their two-party system. It was the way their world worked, a paradigm everyone would understand because everyone was inside it. For them to hear no one can serve two masters, he'll hate one and love the other, takes words with a culturally permeated understanding and wraps something spiritual around it. Empire among empire, and everyone is subject to the empire. Whatever you do serves the master you have or the rebellion you're seeking to uproot them with. But As citizens in a 21st century nuclear superpower global bully, that's not our collective reality. So how do we make it so? We frame ourselves as the evil competing master, the other empire. Anything that we do for ourselves, our own mental and physical well-being or gratification, becomes a betrayal of our master's time, a misuse of talent and breath, because our lives are not our own. We were bought with a price, called children, but servants, to do as we're told, like it or not, whether it feels fair or not, whether we understand it or not, whether it is in our best interest or not, because slaves obey their masters. They don't presume to think for themselves. That's to risk punishment. It's not for the slave to understand. How could the slave understand? And holding on to that framework within our modern conceptions and most ancient ones, we're presented with a God that at best is the slave owner who only beats his slaves if that rich white southerner who just needed help on the farm but has no time for your opinion on the matter. The oxymoronic, kind slave owner. And with this paradigm of God, freedom is the enemy. Our freedom to choose for ourselves instead of blind obedience to the master is why we're in this mess, why we need the master. Because if we were left to our own devices, we would fall into ruin. It's strange how well that preaches from the pulpit and the Klan pamphlet. But the text is simply trapped in a time that's not our own. One where God can't be an abolitionist any more than he could be a capitalist or a hockey fan. It's outside the scope of the authors. And I remember sitting through this sermon back in my old Adventist church, and the minister said, "We're so fortunate that the only God we would want, the best, most loving God that there could be, is the only God that exists." And I sat there through the amens thinking of the 400 years of slavery in Egypt, the 400 years of slavery in the Americas, the Holocaust, friends that have had to bury their children. I thought how eventually this God would have no choice but to kill billions of people dedicated to their love for him for loving him on the wrong day. I thought of how the text says he commanded the genocide of whole cultures just for being in the way. And how even though his depth of love for me knows no bounds, me without his own righteousness is a fully wretched offense worthy of eternal death and separation, because my value is not inherent in being his creation. It's contained solely in my obedience and submission to the slave owner who only beats his slave if. And the thing is, as a black kid in America, I could imagine something more loving than that. For starters, if I were choosing a God, I would have chosen an abolitionist.